I had seen a lot during my years as a paramedic, but no amount of training, no late-night shift in the cold glare of city streets had prepared me for that day. It was supposed to be a routine call, an elderly woman in distress, collapsing at home with shallow breaths and a fading pulse. I was there because this was my calling, my way to serve and heal. The siren blared as I sped through the city, the pulse of urgency in my veins louder than the wailing sound. My partner, Sarah, sat beside me, already calling ahead to prepare the EI. I focused on the road, praying we'd reach the hospital in time. Then, out of nowhere, a patrol car swerved in front of us, its blue lights flashing. I slammed on the brakes, the ambulance screeching to a halt. My heart sank as I recognized the officer stepping out of the car. Officer Tanner, a man with a reputation, and not a good one. He approached with the swagger of authority unchecked, ignoring the emergency we represented. "You were speeding," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. I tried to explain, my hands raised in frustration. "Officer, there's a critical patient in the back. We're en route to the hospital." But Tanner wasn't interested. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His gaze locked onto me, not as a professional doing my job, but as a black man who dared to challenge his authority. The tension boiled over when Tanner shoved me backward, his face twisted in anger. Before I could react, his fist connected with my jaw, sending me sprawling to the ground. Sarah screamed, rushing to help, but he waved her off with a threat. "Stay out of this," he shouted. I tasted blood and humiliation as I got back to my feet, determined not to abandon my duty. Tanner, though, wasn't done. He stormed toward the ambulance, yanking the back doors open, and then he froze. The color drained from his face as he looked at the frail figure lying on the stretcher, gasping for air. "Mom?" he whispered. Tanner's voice, trembling and soft, barely registered over the chaos in my mind. For a moment, the tension in the air turned into something sharper, stranger. His stern demeanor dissolved as he stared at the woman on the stretcher. I scrambled to my feet, wiping the blood from my lip. "Officer, your mother needs urgent care," I said firmly, trying to reignite his humanity. His eyes darted back to me, filled with disbelief and a tinge of panic. What happened to her?" he stammered, his voice unrecognizable compared to his earlier tone. "She collapsed at home. We need to move now, or she won't make it," I snapped, urgency replacing my anger. For a second, Tanner seemed paralyzed, like a statue carved out of fear and regret. But the weight of the situation pressed down on me harder. I pushed past him, stepping into the ambulance. Sarah was already working tirelessly, monitoring the frail woman's vital signs. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low, and she was fading fast. "Step aside or help," I said sharply, looking back at Tanner. "But we don't have time for this." Tanner hesitated, glancing at his patrol car. Whatever authority he thought he had seemed insignificant now. Slowly, he climbed into the ambulance, his shoulders slumped. I'll ride with you," he muttered, his earlier bravado crumbling. I nodded curtly, not having the patience to argue. The doors slammed shut, and Sarah floored it. The siren wailed again, echoing through the narrow streets as I worked on stabilizing the woman. "Ma'am?" I said gently, leaning close to her face. "You're going to be okay. Just hang in there." Tanner sat across from me, his hands trembling as he watched the scene unfold. For a man who had just unleashed his rage on me minutes earlier, he now looked like a child lost in a nightmare. "What's her name?" I asked, trying to keep the situation clinical despite the swirling emotions. "Margaret," he said hoarsely. "Margaret," I repeated, nodding. "Margaret, stay with us. You're strong, and you've got people who need you." Her chest rose and fell unevenly as I adjusted the oxygen mask. Tanner's face was a canvas of guilt and fear. "This can't be happening," he murmured, his hands gripping his knees tightly. She's all I have." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her expression hardening. "Maybe you should have thought about that before wasting precious time," she said, her tone sharp and biting. "Sarah," I said quietly, cutting her off. This wasn't the moment to ignite another confrontation, but I couldn't deny the weight of her words. Every second Tanner had spent asserting his power had cost his mother time we could never get back. As we neared the hospital, the monitors beeped erratically. Margaret's pulse was weak, and I knew we were on the edge of losing her. "Tanner, hold her hand," I ordered, my voice steely. He blinked at me in confusion. "What?" "She needs to know someone's here for her. Hold her hand," I repeated, louder this time. His large, calloused hand reached out hesitantly, encircling his mother's frail fingers. The sight was almost surreal. This hardened officer, so used to being in control, now clinging to his mother like a lifeline. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me. I'm here." Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, her gaze softening as they landed on him. A weak smile curved her lips, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I'm proud of you," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Before he could respond, the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the E. I swung the doors open, and a team of doctors rushed to take over. "Let's move," I shouted, guiding the stretcher through the blinding hospital lights. Tanner trailed behind, his face pale and shell-shocked. As the medical team disappeared into the operating room with Margaret, he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing heavily. My adrenaline had finally begun to subside, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and frustration. "You could have killed her," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of truth. He looked up at me, his eyes red and glassy. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "I swear, I didn't know it was her." "Does it matter?" I shot back. "It shouldn't have mattered who it was. You saw the ambulance, heard the siren, but instead of helping, you chose to let your hate take over." He flinched at my words, but I didn't care. Someone had to say it. "You've got a lot to think about," I added, turning away. "I hope she pulls through for her sake, not yours." The waiting room felt like a liminal space, where time moved painfully slow, yet my thoughts raced uncontrollably. I leaned against the cold, sterile wall, watching Tanner sit motionless in the hard plastic chair. His uniform now looked like a misplaced costume, the badge and belt doing little to shield him from the gravity of his actions. I couldn't bring myself to sit beside him. Not yet, not after what he'd done. My jaw still ached where his fist had landed, a sharp reminder of how much his anger had clouded his judgment. Sarah walked over, handing me an ice pack. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but her eyes said what we were both thinking. This didn't have to happen. "You okay?" she asked quietly, nodding toward my face. "I live," I replied, taking the ice pack and pressing it against my swollen jaw. My gaze flickered toward Tanner, who hadn't moved since his mother was wheeled into surgery. "But this isn't about me right now." Sarah followed my gaze and let out a bitter laugh. "Funny how that works, huh? The guy almost got us all killed, and now he's the one falling apart." "Yeah," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "Karma's got a weird sense of timing." The doors to the surgical wing swung open, and a doctor stepped out, clipboard in hand. Tanner shot to his feet, his movements abrupt and unsteady. "How is she?" he asked, his voice thick with desperation. The doctor's expression was neutral, professional. "She's stable for now, but her condition is critical. The heart attack caused significant damage. We've done everything we can, but the next 24 hours will be crucial. She needs rest, and no visitors for now." Tanner nodded numbly, sinking back into his chair as the doctor disappeared down the corridor. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of hospital staff. Then Tanner looked at me, his expression raw and unguarded. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and awkward. I didn't respond right away, unsure if I even wanted to. "You didn't just hurt me," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "You put everyone in danger. Your mother, me, Sarah, all because you couldn't see past whatever hate or fear you were carrying." He flinched, but didn't argue. Instead, he looked down at his hands, which were still trembling. "I don't know why I did it," he admitted. I've been like this for so long. I didn't think. I just reacted." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. Part of me wanted to walk away, leave him alone with his guilt. But another part, the part that had chosen this line of work, knew I couldn't. Why? I asked, stepping closer. Why do you hate people like me so much? He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked, and his eyes flicked away as if he was ashamed to meet my gaze. Finally, he sighed. My dad, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He raised me to think, to believe that people like you were the problem, that you were dangerous, lazy, or didn't belong. And I believed him. I let his words sink in, feeling the sting of them. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like this, but hearing it now, in this context, felt different. And now? I asked, crossing my arms. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and uncertainty. Now, I don't know what to believe, he admitted. Seeing you fight to save her, seeing how much you care, even after what I did. He shook his head as if trying to piece together his fractured worldview. You've got a long road ahead, I said bluntly. It's not enough to feel bad. You've got to unlearn all that hate, and that's going to take work, real work. He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. I want to try, he said. I need to. I wanted to believe him, but I knew better than to trust words alone. Actions mattered more, and only time would tell if he was truly willing to change. Just then, Sarah approached, holding her phone. The station's calling, she said, her tone neutral. They want to know where Tanner is. Tanner looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I could see their fear of accountability, of facing the consequences of what he'd done. You should answer it, I said firmly. Own up to what you did. That's the first step. He hesitated, then nodded. Taking the phone, he stepped away to make the call. As I watched him go, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, hope. This wasn't the ending. It wasn't even close. But it was a start. I stayed in the waiting room as Tanner took the call. It was a quiet space, except for the occasional murmur of families huddled together and the distant beeping of machines. Sarah had gone to check on our ambulance, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echoes of the day's events. When Tanner returned, his face was pale, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. They want me back at the station, he said, his voice hollow. I told them what happened, about stopping the ambulance, hitting you. And, I asked, crossing my arms. They said there's going to be an investigation, he replied. Suspension, maybe more. I studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of defiance or resentment. But all I saw was a man unraveling, grappling with the weight of his actions. You should go, I said. Face the music. It's the least you can do. He hesitated, looking toward the surgical ward, where his mother was still fighting for her life. I can't leave her, he said. Not like this. His vulnerability caught me off guard, but I didn't soften. That's not my problem, Tanner. You made your choices. Now you deal with the fallout. Before he could respond, a nurse entered the waiting area, her expression serious. Mr. Tanner? She called out. He rushed forward. Yes, that's me. There's been a complication, the nurse said, lowering her voice. Your mother's heart stopped during surgery. We managed to resuscitate her, but she's in critical condition. You may want to see her now. Tanner's knees buckled, and for a moment, I thought he might collapse. He gripped the back of a chair, steadying himself, before nodding. Take me to her, he said hoarsely. I watched him disappear down the hall, conflicted. Part of me felt he deserved the pain he was feeling. After all, his actions had contributed to this moment. But another part of me, the part that had spent years saving lives, couldn't ignore his anguish. Minutes later, Sarah returned, her expression grim. What now? She asked, noticing my distracted state. Tanner's with his mom, I said, but it's bad, real bad. Sarah frowned, sitting beside me. Think he's going to change? I don't know, I admitted, but he's got a lot to answer for, and I'm not letting him off the hook. As we sat in silence, Tanner reappeared, his face streaked with tears. She's awake, he said. Barely, but she's awake. For the first time, his voice cracked, exposing the raw humanity beneath his uniform. She asked for you, he added, looking directly at me. Me? I said, startled. she said. She wanted to thank the paramedic who saved her. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Tanner looked so out of place, this towering figure of authority reduced to a desperate son. Against my better judgment, I stood and followed him back to his mother's room. Margaret lay in the bed, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, the rhythmic beeping a fragile reminder of life. Her eyes fluttered open as we entered, and when she saw me, a faint smile spread across her face. "You're the one?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one who brought me here?" "Yes, ma'am," I said softly, stepping closer. "You're a fighter. We just gave you a ride." Her frail hand reached out, and I hesitated before taking it gently. Her grip was weak but steady. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "You didn't have to, but you did, and I—" Her voice broke, and she turned her gaze to Tanner. "I'm sorry. For him." "Mom," Tanner said, his voice choked. "No," she insisted, her eyes sharp despite her condition. "Let me say this." She looked back at me. "I raised him better than this. I don't know when or why he changed, but please believe me when I say this isn't who he's meant to be." Her words hit harder than I expected, and for the first time, I saw Tanner not as the aggressor, but as a man trapped by his own choices. "I believe you," I said, my voice steady, "but it's up to him to prove it." Margaret nodded, her strength fading. "Promise me you'll forgive him," she said, looking at me with pleading eyes. I hesitated. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easy, especially after what he'd done. But seeing her like this, so fragile and full of hope, made me realize this wasn't just about Tanner. It was about breaking the cycle, about healing, even when it felt impossible. "I'll try," I said finally. She smiled faintly, her eyes closing as sleep took over. Tanner stood beside her, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his armor, and I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The drive back from the hospital was quiet. Tanner had chosen to stay behind with his mother, leaving Sarah and me to handle the rest of our shift. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on my chest, and I could tell Sarah was feeling it too. She broke the silence first. "You believe her?" she asked, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Who?" I replied, even though I already knew the answer. "His mom. But she said he wasn't always like this." I leaned back in the passenger seat, watching the city lights streak past the window. "I don't know. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was. Either way, what he's done is on him." Sarah nodded, her jaw tightening. "But she asked you to forgive him." "Yeah," I said softly. "She did." The thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Forgiveness wasn't a concept I struggled with in theory. I'd forgiven plenty of people in my life, but this felt different. Tanner had crossed a line, one that endangered lives, and he had done so willingly. "Do you think he meant what he said?" Sarah asked, glancing at me briefly before returning her focus to the road. "About changing?" I shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. People say all kinds of things when they're desperate." The station came into view, its familiar shape oddly comforting after the chaos of the day. Sarah parked the ambulance, and we sat there for a moment, neither of us making a move to get out. Finally, she turned to me, her expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "So what now? You gonna let it go? Or report him?" I sighed, running a hand over my face. "I don't know. Part of me wants to make sure he pays for what he did. But another part of me—" I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. "Wants to believe he can change?" Sarah finished for me. "Yeah," I admitted. "Something like that." We got out and walked inside, the station bustling with activity as usual. Paperwork and post-shift briefings filled the next hour, a welcome distraction from my swirling thoughts. But even as I tried to focus, Tanner's face, his guilt, his tears, kept creeping back into my mind. Later that night, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Tanner. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I just wanted to thank you again. Not just for saving my mom, but for giving me a chance to see the truth about myself. I'm sorry for what I did, and I promise I'll make it right." I stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. A part of me wanted to delete the message, to cut him out entirely. But another part, the part that had held his mother's frail hand and seen the pain in her eyes, couldn't ignore it. After a long pause, I typed back a short reply. Words aren't enough. Do the work. The next morning, I heard through the grapevine that Tanner had turned in his badge. Rumors spread quickly in our line of work, and by the time my shift started, everyone seemed to know. You hear about Tanner? Sarah asked as we prepared the ambulance for the day. Yeah, I said. Turned in his badge. Think he'll stay gone? Who knows? I replied, shrugging. Maybe he's finally realized the damage he's done. That day, the calls came one after another: heart attacks, accidents, even a small fire. It was almost enough to drown out the memories of Tanner's face, the sound of his mother's faint voice, but not quite. Toward the end of the shift, we were dispatched to a community center on the other side of town. A group of volunteers had been injured while unloading supplies, and they needed medical assistance. When we arrived, I was surprised to see Tanner there, out of uniform and helping coordinate the effort. He looked up as we approached, and for a moment, our eyes met. He didn't say anything, just gave me a small nod before turning back to the group he was helping. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Is that Tanner? Looks like it, I said, my voice neutral. We went about our work, treating minor injuries and assuring everyone was stable. Tanner stayed on the periphery, avoiding direct interaction, but clearly putting in the effort to help. As we packed up to leave, he finally approached me. I'm trying, he said quietly. I see that, I replied, my tone neither forgiving nor harsh. Thank you, he said, his voice earnest, for everything. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked him in the eye, searching for something: sincerity, regret, hope. Keep trying, I said finally. It's a long road. He nodded, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. The encounter with Tanner at the community center lingered in my mind longer than I cared to admit. As much as I wanted to compartmentalize and move on, the remnants of that day, the punch, his mother's fragile plea, and his quiet attempts at redemption kept resurfacing. Sarah, as usual, voiced what I was reluctant to say aloud during our next shift. So, you think Tanner's for real? Or is he just putting on a show to clear his conscience? I shrugged, adjusting the band on my wristwatch. I think he's trying. Whether that's enough? I guess time will tell. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she tightened the strap of her trauma bag. You're a better person than me. I'd want him to suffer a little more before I even considered forgiving him. I chuckled softly. You're not wrong, but his suffering isn't really my job. If he wants to change, it's on him. I've got enough on my plate as it is. As if the universe wanted to remind me of that fact, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, sending us to yet another emergency. This time, it was a multiple vehicle accident on the freeway, a collision that sounded bad enough to warrant all hands on deck. By the time we arrived, the scene was chaotic. Firefighters were working to extricate trapped drivers, while police directed traffic and tried to assess the situation. I caught sight of one officer waving us down, his face pale under the flashing emergency lights. Over here, he shouted, pointing to an overturned sedan with smoke rising from its engine. There's a kid in the back. Sarah and I rushed forward, gear in hand. A fire crew had already pried the door open, and I could see a little girl, no older than 6, curled up in her booster seat, her face streaked with blood and tears. Hey there, I said gently, climbing into the wreckage to reach her. My name's Marcus. I'm here to help you. Okay? She whimpered but nodded, her wide eyes darting between me and the firefighters. Her legs pinned, one of them said, pointing to where the metal frame had crumpled against her seat. We're going to get you out of here, I said, my voice calm despite the knot forming in my stomach. But I need you to stay really still, okay? Can you do that for me? She nodded again, biting her lip to keep from crying out as I worked to free her. Minutes felt like hours, but we finally managed to extract her. As I carried her toward the ambulance, I couldn't help but notice one of the officers standing nearby Tanner. He wasn't directing traffic or filling out reports. Instead, he was crouched beside a woman who had been ejected from one of the cars, holding her hand and speaking to her softly. The sight stopped me in my tracks for a moment. This wasn't the Tanner I'd known. This was someone else entirely. Marcus! Sarah's voice snapped me out of it. Let's go. I hurried to the ambulance, laying the girl gently on the stretcher as Sarah began checking her vitals. She's stable, Sarah muttered, glancing at the monitors. But she's going to need surgery on that leg. As we sped toward the hospital, my thoughts kept drifting back to Tanner. Was he really trying to change? Or was this all just an elaborate act? Later that night, as I was wrapping up paperwork, I received a surprising call from the hospital. The girl we had rescued, Mia, was stable and expected to recover fully. That wasn't the surprising part. Her mother asked to speak with you, the nurse said. Curious, I made my way to the room where Mia's mother was resting. She looked tired but managed a weak smile when I entered. You're Marcus, right? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am, I replied. How are you feeling? Better, thanks to you, she said, her smile faltering. But I wanted to talk to you about the officer who was there, the one who stayed with me. I froze, already knowing where this was going. He saved my life, she said. I don't know his name, but he stayed with me the whole time, even when everyone else was busy. He kept saying I'd be okay, and I believed him. Please, can you thank him for me? Her words hit me harder than I expected. I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. I'll pass it along, I said. Back at the station, I ran into Tanner in the hallway. He looked exhausted, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I heard about the accident, I said, crossing my arms, and about what you did. He shrugged, looking down at his hands. It's not much, just trying to do the right thing for once. You saved someone's life, I said. That's not nothing. He looked up, surprised. Thanks, he said quietly. That means a lot. For the first time, I saw something in him that felt real, an ember of hope, flickering but alive. The next few weeks were a blur of back-to-back shifts and late nights, but Tanner's name kept surfacing in unexpected ways. At first, it was the murmurs around the station whispers of how he'd been spotted volunteering at community events, offering his time to programs aimed at helping underprivileged neighborhoods. Then there were the stories from the hospital, where staff mentioned an ex-cop who seemed determined to do right by everyone he crossed paths with. I wasn't sure what to make of it. People didn't change overnight, and Tanner's past couldn't simply be erased by good deeds. Still, it was hard to deny that something in him had shifted. Sarah, as always, was quick to voice her skepticism during a quiet moment in the ambulance. So, what's the deal with Tanner now? Is he running for sainthood or something? I glanced at her, shaking my head. I don't know. Maybe he's just trying to make amends. She snorted, rolling her eyes. Amends don't fix broken jaws, Marcus, or stop people from bleeding out in ambulances. Her words hit a nerve, but I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the city blur past. People aren't just one thing, I said finally. They're not just the worst thing they've done, or the best. They're the sum of it all. He's trying, and that's got to count for something. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. I get it. I do, but you're a better person than me, because I'm not sure I could forgive him if I were in your shoes. I didn't tell her that I wasn't sure I'd forgiven him either. Later that week, I ran into Tanner again, this time at a local rec center where I'd been invited to speak about emergency preparedness. He was standing near the entrance, handing out flyers for a new mentorship program. He spotted me and hesitated before approaching, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Marcus, he said, nodding. Tanner, I replied, my tone guarded but not hostile. I wasn't expecting to see you here, he admitted. Same, I said, glancing at the flyers. What's this about? Mentorship program, he explained, for at-risk youth, trying to give them the guidance I never had. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you'd describe yourself as at risk? He laughed softly, a dry, self-deprecating sound. You'd be surprised. Growing up, I wasn't much different from some of these kids. Just angry all the time, looking for someone to blame. And now? I asked, crossing my arms. Now I'm trying to make sure they don't end up like me, he said, his tone earnest. Or worse. It was hard not to respect the effort, even if I still had my doubts. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. "Is it guilt? Redemption? Something else?" He looked down, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe it's a little of everything," he admitted. "I screwed up, big time, and I don't know if I'll ever make up for it, but I've got to try. If I don't, then what's the point?" His honesty caught me off guard. For once, there was no defensiveness, no bravado, just a man trying to pick up the pieces of a broken life. I nodded slowly, not ready to give him full credit, but willing to acknowledge his effort. "Keep at it," I said. "Words are easy. It's the actions that count." He smiled faintly. "I know, and I'll prove it, even if it takes the rest of my life." That evening, I found myself reflecting on the conversation. Forgiveness had always seemed like a clean break, a moment of letting go. But this felt Messier like an ongoing process, one that required as much work from me as it did from him. Later, I stopped by the hospital to check on Mia, the little girl we'd rescued from the car accident. She was recovering well, her leg in a cast, but her spirit as bright as ever. Her mother greeted me warmly. "She talks about you all the time," she said, smiling. "Wants to be a paramedic now." I laughed, kneeling beside Mia's bed. "You're going to make a great one," I said. "But you've got to let that leg heal first." As I chatted with her, I noticed a familiar figure in the hallway tenor. He was carrying a box of toys, handing them out to children in the ward. Mia's mother noticed him too. "That's him," she said quietly, "the officer who saved me." I nodded, watching as Tanner knelt to talk to a boy who was clutching a stuffed animal. There was something genuine in his demeanor, a kindness that felt real. For the first time, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was capable of real change. It was late one night, well past the end of my shift, when I received an unexpected phone call. The number wasn't familiar, but something about the timing made me pick up anyway. "Marcus?" The voice on the other end asked. It was Tanner, and he sounded tense. "Tanner? It's late. What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself for something serious. "I need your help," he said, his voice hurried and low. "It's about the mentorship program. Some of the kids, something's going on, and I don't know how to handle it." His words immediately put me on alert. "What do you mean, something's going on? Are they in danger?" "Not exactly," Tanner said, but the hesitation in his voice made it clear he wasn't sure. "I've been hearing things. Some of the kids have been talking about someone new showing up in the neighborhood. A guy promising easy money if they join him. Drugs, Marcus. I think he's targeting them." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories like this. Predators like that thrived in places where hope was scarce, where vulnerable kids were searching for any escape. "Do you know who this guy is?" I asked. "No," Tanner admitted, "but the kids are scared. They won't say much, but I can tell it's serious. I was hoping you could help me talk to them, maybe get them to open up." For a moment, I was torn. Tanner's intentions seemed genuine, but this was dangerous territory. Getting involved meant putting myself in the middle of something that could easily spiral out of control. "Why me?" I asked. "You're the one running the program. Why can't you handle this?" "Because they trust you," Tanner said simply. "They've seen what you do. They know you're not just another authority figure looking to lecture them. Please, Marcus, I need your help." His desperation was palpable, and against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. "All right," I said, "but if we're doing this, we do it carefully. No rushing in blind." "Got it," Tanner said, relief evident in his voice. "Can you meet me tomorrow at the center?" "I'll be there," I said, hanging up. The next day, the community center felt different. There was an underlying tension in the air, a quiet unease that hadn't been there before. Kids who were usually laughing and playing seemed withdrawn, their eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every few minutes. Tanner met me by the gym, his expression grim. "Thanks for coming," he said, handing me a clipboard with the day's schedule. "The ones I'm worried about are in the art room. I'll introduce you." As we walked down the hallway, I could feel eyes following us. Some of the kids peeked out from behind doors, their curiosity mingled with apprehension. In the art room, a group of teenagers was clustered around a table, pretending to focus on their sketches. Tanner cleared his throat, and they looked up, their expressions guarded. "This is Marcus," he said. "He's a paramedic, and he's here to help." "Help with what?" one of the boys asked, his tone defensive. "With whatever's got you looking over your shoulders," I said, pulling up a chair. "Look, I'm not here to lecture you or snitch to anyone. I've been where you are, and I know how tough it can be. But if someone's messing with you, I need to know so we can do something about it." The group exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Finally, a girl with braids and a sharp glare broke the silence. "You can't do anything," she said. "Nobody can." "He's everywhere." "Who's everywhere?" I asked gently. She hesitated, looking down at her sketchpad. "His name's Ray," she said quietly. "He showed up a few weeks ago, saying he could get us money, clothes, whatever we wanted. But now he's saying we owe him." A boy beside her nodded. "He's got people watching us. My cousin tried to tell him no, and now he's got a black eye." The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over us. Tanner looked like he wanted to break something, his fists clenched at his sides. "Have you told anyone else about this?" I asked. "No," the girl said, shaking her head. "What's the point? The cops don't care. They never have." Her words hit harder than I expected, and I glanced at Tanner, who looked equally affected. "We care," I said firmly, "and we're going to do something about this. But I need you to trust me." "Can you do that?" The kids exchanged hesitant glances before nodding slowly. "Good," I said. "Now tell me everything you know about this Ray guy." That night, Tanner and I sat in my apartment, piecing together the information the kids had given us. Ray wasn't just some low-level thug. He had connections, and his reach extended far beyond this neighborhood. "This is bigger than I thought," Tanner admitted, rubbing his temples. "Yeah," I said, "and if we're not careful, it's going to get a lot worse." For the first time, Tanner's resolve faltered. "What if we can't stop him?" I looked him in the eye. "Then we find someone who can." Tanner and I spent the next several days doing what we could to dig deeper into Ray and his operations. The more we learned, the more apparent it became that we were in over our heads. Ray wasn't just targeting kids. He had ties to a larger network, pulling strings that reached beyond this neighborhood. Tanner seemed more determined than ever, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. His face was drawn, and the weariness in his eyes was unmistakable. For all his effort to be the calm leader these kids needed, he was unraveling under the pressure. "Do you ever feel like you're trying to empty the ocean with a bucket?" he asked one night as we sat in the community center after hours, reviewing what little intel we had. "All the time," I admitted. "But you keep going because even if you can't fix everything, you can save someone? Sometimes that's enough." He nodded, but his expression remained heavy. "What if it's not enough?" Before I could respond, the door creaked open, and one of the kids, the boy with the black eye, slipped inside. He hesitated when he saw us, his gaze flickering nervously between Tanner and me. "Jerome," Tanner said, his voice calm but firm, "what are you doing here this late?" Jerome stepped closer, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. I thought you should see this," he said, handing it to Tanner. Tanner unfolded the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the scribbled message. "This is your only warning. Stay out of our business." The note sent a chill down my spine. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "It was in my locker," Jerome said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know who else to tell." Tanner cursed under his breath, crumpling the note in his fist. "He's trying to scare you," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Don't let him. We're going to stop this." Jerome's eyes widened. "How?" "He's got guys everywhere." "If he finds out I told you." "He won't," I interrupted, stepping closer. "You did the right thing, Jerome, but now we need you to trust us. We'll handle this." Jerome nodded reluctantly, but the fear in his eyes lingered as he left the room. The note changed everything. What had been a tenuous effort to gather information now felt like a ticking time bomb. Ray clearly knew we were getting close, and he wasn't going to back down without a fight. "We need help," Tanner said as soon as Jerome was gone. "We can't do this alone." "Agreed," I said. "But who do we trust? The cops. You know as well as I do that they won't take this seriously unless there's something in it for them." Tanner's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like the man I'd first encountered, the one who had stopped an ambulance without a second thought. But this time, his anger felt different, more focused. "There's someone," he said finally. "An old friend. He's still on the force, but he's not like the others. If anyone will listen, it's him." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "Because if this goes sideways, I'm sure," Tanner said firmly. "I'll call him tomorrow." The next day, Tanner's friend Detective Kyle Brennan met us at a diner on the edge of town. He was older than Tanner, with a sharp gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. "So," Brennan said, leaning back in his chair, "this is the mess you've gotten yourself into." Tanner bristled slightly at his tone, but he nodded. "Yeah, and we need your help to clean it up." Brennan glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "And you are?" "Marcus," I said, extending a hand. "Paramedic. I'm the one who pulled Tanner's mom out of an ambulance after he nearly killed her by stopping us." Brennan's eyebrows shot up, and he let out a low whistle. "That's quite an introduction." "It's been a long couple of months," I said dryly. Brennan chuckled, but his expression quickly turned serious. "Look, I'll be honest. Going after someone like Ray isn't easy. Guys like him have resources, connections. If you don't have airtight evidence, he'll walk, and you'll be lucky if he doesn't come after you in the process. We've got kids scared to go to school because of him," Tanner said, his voice low and angry. "If we don't do something, they're going to end up in his pocket or worse." Brennan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said. "I'll look into it, but you need to tread carefully. Ray's not just some street thug. He's got people in his corner, and if you're not careful, you're going to find out the hard way just how deep this goes." Tanner and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the weight of his words. "Thanks," Tanner said finally. "We'll be careful." As we left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just taken a step into something far bigger than we'd anticipated. Tanner seemed to feel it too, his expression grim as we walked back to the car. "This is it," he said quietly. "If we're going to do this, we can't back out now." I nodded, the knot in my stomach tightening. Let's just hope we're ready for what's coming. Over the next week, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Ray's grip was tightening, his name whispered in fear at the community center and in the streets. Tanner's old friend, Detective Brennan, had started digging into Ray's operation, but the process was slow, hampered by bureaucracy and corruption within the department. Meanwhile, Tanner and I doubled down on our efforts to protect the kids at the mentorship program. We started walking them home after meetings, making sure they weren't alone for long. Despite our precautions, the unease lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. It was during one of these walks that things took a dangerous turn. Tanner and I were escorting Jerome and a couple of the other kids to their apartment building when we noticed a car trailing us. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled too long at each stop sign, keeping a deliberate distance. Tanner's jaw tightened as he glanced back over his shoulder. "We've got company," he muttered. "I see it," I replied, my voice low. Jerome looked up at us, his face pale. "Is it him?" He whispered. "Probably," Tanner said, his voice calm but firm. "Just keep walking. Don't look back." We quickened our pace, turning down side streets in an attempt to lose the car. But it stayed with us, creeping closer with each turn. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear growing in the kids' eyes. Finally, Tanner stopped and turned to face the car, his hand instinctively going to his hip only to remember he wasn't a cop anymore. He didn't have a weapon, just the weight of his presence and a sheer will to protect. The car stopped a few yards away, and the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the low light. "Evening," the man drawled, his tone casual but menacing. "Heard you've been sticking your noses where they don't belong." Tanner stepped forward, positioning himself between the man and the kids. "We're just trying to keep them safe," he said. "That a problem for you?" The man smirked, pulling a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. "You don't get it, do you? This neighborhood's mine. These kids, they're mine too. And if you keep interfering, you're going to regret it." I clenched my fists resisting the urge to lash out. They don't belong to anyone, I said. They deserve a chance to live their lives without fear. The man took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling smoke into the night air. You're brave, he said, his tone mocking. I'll give you that, but bravery doesn't mean much when you're 6 feet under. Tanner's stance shifted slightly, his muscles tense. Are you threatening us? The man chuckled, tossing his cigarette to the ground and grinding it under his heel. Take it however you want, he said. But if I see you again, we won't be having a friendly chat. With that, he turned and got back into the car. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off, leaving us standing in the middle of the street. Jerome was trembling, his eyes wide with fear. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tanner knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We're going to fight back, he said, but not like this. We'll do it the right way with evidence, with the law on our side. Trust me, Jerome. We're not going to let him win. The encounter shook all of us. Tanner and I reported the incident to Brennan, who confirmed the man was one of Ray's enforcers, a dangerous individual with a long rap sheet. But without solid evidence linking him to Ray's operation, there wasn't much the police could do. This is bigger than just you two, Brennan said during a late-night meeting at the diner. If you're not careful, you're going to get yourselves killed. We need something concrete, a recording, documents, something that ties Ray directly to these threats. And how are we supposed to get that? Tanner asked, his frustration evident. Brennan hesitated before leaning closer. There's a spot they used to meet the old warehouse on 12th Street. It's risky, but if you can get in there and record something, it might be enough to bring him down. You're asking us to spy on a drug ring? I said, incredulous. Do you realize how dangerous that is? Brennan nodded grimly. I do, but if you want to stop Ray, this might be your only shot. Tanner and I exchanged a glance. Everything about this plan screamed danger, but it was clear we were running out of options. Ray wasn't going to back down, and the kids couldn't wait for bureaucracy to catch up. I'll do it, Tanner said finally, his voice steady. No, I interjected. We'll do it. You're not going in there alone. Tanner looked at me, surprised, but he didn't argue. As we left the diner, the gravity of what we were about to do settled over us. This was at the point of no return. You sure about this? Tanner asked as we got into the car. No, I admitted. But if it means keeping those kids safe, then yeah, I'm sure. The warehouse loomed ahead of us, a hulking shadow against the faint glow of the city skyline. Its broken windows and rusted exterior made it look abandoned, but the faint hum of activity inside told a different story. Tanner and I sat in the car, nerves stretched taut as we finalized our plan. We go in, stick to the shadows, and get what we need, I said, adjusting the tiny recording device Brennan had provided. No heroics, Tanner. We're not here to fight just to get evidence. Tanner nodded, but his clenched fists told me he was ready for more than just surveillance. You sure you want to do this? I asked, giving him one last out. He turned to me, his jaw set. They need us, he said simply. The weight of his words settled between us. There was no turning back now. We slipped in through a side entrance, the metal door creaking slightly as we eased it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and damp concrete. Stacks of crates and machinery provided plenty of cover, but the faint sound of voices echoed ominously through the cavernous space. Tanner motioned for me to follow as we crept closer to the source of the voices. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Every step felt like a gamble one wrong move, and this could all go sideways. When we reached the edge of the storage area, we crouched behind a stack of pallets. Ahead, a group of men stood around a table covered in papers and bags of powder. At the center was Ray, his presence commanding and cold. This shipment needs to move tomorrow, Ray said, his voice low and authoritative, and I don't want any mistakes. We've got enough heat as it is. One of the men nodded, pulling out a notepad. What about the kids at the center? He asked. Some of them are starting to push back. Ray's expression darkened. Handle it, he said simply. I don't care how. If they won't play ball, Make an example out of one of them. That'll shut the rest up. I felt Tanner tense beside me, his fists clenching so tightly I thought he might break cover. I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. Not yet. Tanner took a shaky breath, nodding reluctantly. The conversation continued, each word making my stomach churn. Ray wasn't just a thug he was calculating, willing to destroy lives to maintain control. And the men around him followed his orders without question. I activated the recorder, praying it was picking up everything. We stayed hidden, listening as they detailed their operations, the shipments, the bribes, the threats. It was enough to bring him down, but we needed to get out with the evidence intact. Just as I was about to signal Tanner to retreat, one of the men looked toward the pallets. "Did you hear that?" he asked, stepping closer. My breath caught in my throat as Tanner and I pressed ourselves against the cold concrete floor. The man's footsteps grew louder, the beam of his flashlight sweeping dangerously close. Tanner glanced at me, his expression taut with determination. He was ready to fight if it came to that, but I silently willed him to stay calm. The footsteps stopped inches away from our hiding spot. "It's nothing," another voice called out. "Probably just rats." The man hesitated, then turned back toward the group. I exhaled quietly, relief washing over me, but we weren't out of danger yet. As we carefully made our way back toward the exit, a sudden shout froze us in our tracks. "Hey, who's there?" The beam of a flashlight landed squarely on Tanner's back. "Run!" Tanner shouted, shoving me toward the door. I hesitated for a split second before bolting, the sound of footsteps and shouts behind me. Tanner stayed behind, drawing their attention as I sprinted through the labyrinth of crates. When I reached the side door, I turned back, my chest heaving. I couldn't just leave him. "Tanner!" I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. Seconds later, he appeared, limping slightly but alive. "Let's go," he said, pushing me out the door. We ran until my lungs burned, finally collapsing behind an abandoned car a few blocks away. Tanner was bleeding from a gash on his arm, but he waved me off when I tried to help. "Did you get it?" he asked, his voice ragged. I held up the recorder, the tiny device feeling heavier than it should. "Yeah," I said. "We got it." Tanner nodded, leaning back against the car with a tired smile. Then it was worth it. Back at my apartment, we played the recording for Brennan. His expression grew darker with each passing second, but by the end, he looked almost relieved. "This is enough," he said. "We can get a warrant, bring him in. You two did good." Tanner and I exchanged a glance, the enormity of what we'd done finally sinking in. "Let's just hope it's enough to end this," I said quietly. The next morning, the recording Tanner and I had captured was handed off to Detective Brennan. True to his word, he moved fast, using the evidence to secure a warrant against Ray and his operation. Tanner and I stayed out of the spotlight, knowing that any direct involvement from us could put the kids and ourselves in more danger. Despite the progress, the hours stretched on with agonizing slowness. Brennan kept us updated as the raid was planned, but the waiting gnawed at me. Every passing moment felt like an eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something could still go wrong. Tanner seemed equally restless. He paced the small confines of my apartment, his fists clenching and unclenching. "What if it's not enough?" he asked, breaking the silence. I looked up from my seat at the kitchen table. "It's enough," I said firmly. "We heard everything. They can't ignore this." He stopped pacing, leaning against the wall with a heavy sigh. "Yeah, but guys like Ray don't go down easy. He's got connections, money. Even if they arrest him, what's stopping him from walking free?" I didn't have an answer for that. Tanner was right. Ray wasn't just a thug. He had resources, and his influence ran deep, but I refused to let fear paralyze us. "We did what we could," I said. "Now it's up to Brennan and the courts." Tanner nodded reluctantly, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Brennan called. "We're moving in tonight," he said. "The raid's set for midnight. Stay put and let us handle it." "Got it," I replied, hanging up. Tanner raised an eyebrow. "What did he say?" "They're going in tonight," I said. Tanner nodded, but instead of relaxing, he grabbed his jacket. "Where are you going?" I asked, alarmed. I need to see this through, he said, his voice steady. No, I said, stepping in front of him. Brennan told us to stay out of it. If you show up, you'll just complicate things. He met my gaze, his expression unwavering. I'm not going to interfere. I just need to know it's really over, that those kids don't have to live in fear anymore. I sighed, realizing I wasn't going to change his mind. Fine, I said, but I'm coming with you. We parked a safe distance from the warehouse, the night cloaking us in darkness. From our vantage point, we could see the glow of police lights reflecting off nearby buildings. SWAT teams moved in silence, their movements methodical and precise. Tanner and I stayed low, our breaths misting in the cool night air. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity. Suddenly, a sharp burst of sound shattered the quiet. The crack of gunfire echoed through the streets, followed by shouted commands. Tanner tensed beside me, his fists clenching. Stay here, I said firmly, grabbing his arm as he moved to stand. I can't just sit here, he hissed. You don't have a choice, I said, my voice low but commanding. If you go in there now, you'll just get yourself killed. Reluctantly, he sank back down, his jaw tight with frustration. The gunfire died down after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. One by one, officers emerged from the warehouse, their faces grim but determined. Then we saw him. Ray was dragged out in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. Even from a distance, I could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't over for him, not by a long shot. Brennan followed close behind, his expression unreadable as he gave orders to his team. Tanner let out a shaky breath beside me. They got him, he said, almost in disbelief. They did, I said, my own relief tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. Brennan called us the next morning to debrief. Ray's in custody, he said. The evidence you got was enough to tie him to the drugs and the threats against the kids. He's not walking away from this. What about his people? Tanner asked. Most of them were rounded up in the raid, Brennan said. But some slipped through the cracks. It's going to take time to dismantle the rest of his network. Tanner nodded, his expression grim but resolute. Time we'll use to keep the kids safe, he said. Brennan smiled faintly. You've done good, Tanner. Both of you. Not many people would have stuck their necks out like that. We didn't do it for recognition, I said. We did it because someone had to. That evening, Tanner and I returned to the community center. The atmosphere was lighter, the kids laughing and playing like they hadn't in weeks. Jerome ran up to us, a wide grin on his face. Did they get him? He asked eagerly. They got him, Tanner said, ruffling the boy's hair. Jerome's smile widened, and for the first time, I saw hope in his eyes. As the sun set outside, I realized that this wasn't the end of the story. It was a new beginning for all of us. The weeks following the raid on Ray's operation were a mix of relief and uncertainty. The community center became a hub of renewed hope, but the scars left by Ray's reign weren't easily erased. Some of the kids who had been under his thumb were still hesitant to trust anyone, their eyes wary as they moved through the halls. Tanner, to his credit, poured himself into the mentorship program with an intensity I hadn't seen before. He organized workshops, brought in guest speakers, and even started leading basketball games in the worn-down gym. The kids slowly warmed to him, their walls cracking just enough to let in the possibility of change. But for all the progress we'd made, the shadow of Ray's network loomed large. Detective Brennan kept us updated, and while Ray himself was in jail, his lieutenants were still out there. Rumors began to surface, whispers that someone new was stepping in to fill the power vacuum he'd left behind. The tension reached its peak one Friday evening when Tanner and I were at the center cleaning up after a workshop. Jerome burst into the room, his face pale and his breathing ragged. They're back, he said, his voice trembling. Who's back? Tanner asked, his tone immediately sharp. Ray's guys, Jerome said. They're outside, by the basketball court. They're talking to the younger kids, trying to get them to come with them. Tanner and I exchanged a glance. The fragile progress we'd made was at risk of shattering in an instant. Stay here, Tanner said firmly, grabbing his jacket. No way, I said, stepping in front of him. You're not going out there alone. This isn't your fight, Marcus, Tanner said, his voice tight. Like hell it's not, I shot back. We've come too far to let them undo everything now. We stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the distant hum of traffic mingling with the laughter of kids still lingering near the court. Near the fence, a group of men stood clustered together, their postures casual, but their intentions unmistakable. Tanner squared his shoulders as we approached, his voice calm but firm. Evening, gentlemen. Can I help you with something? One of the men turned, his face splitting into a smirk. Tanner, he said, dragging out the name like it was a joke. Heard you've been playing hero? Cute. I'm not playing, Tanner said, his tone icy. And you're trespassing. Leave now. The man chuckled, glancing back at his crew. Or what? You gonna call the cops? We both know they don't care about this place. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my voice steady. This isn't about the cops. It's about these kids. They've been through enough. Leave them alone. The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, stepping closer. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered. Tanner stepped in front of me, his presence towering. You think we're scared of you? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. We're not, and neither are they. As if on cue, the door to the community center swung open, and a dozen kids stepped outside. Some of the older ones held basketballs, their expressions defiant. Jerome was among them, his face set with determination. The man's eyes flicked between Tanner and me and the growing crowd of kids. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but then his smirk returned. This isn't over, he said, stepping back toward the fence. You can't protect them forever. With that, he and his crew melted into the shadows, their presence lingering like a bad memory. Back inside, the relief was palpable. The kids were safe for now, but Tanner and I both knew the fight wasn't over. Thanks for having my back, Tanner said quietly as we cleaned up. Always, I replied. But we can't keep doing this on our own. Tanner nodded, his jaw tightening. I know. We need to bring the community into this. The parents, the teachers, everyone. If we're going to keep these kids safe, we have to do it together. In the days that followed, Tanner spearheaded a new initiative, a coalition of parents, local leaders, and volunteers dedicated to reclaiming the neighborhood. The mentorship program expanded, offering tutoring, job training, and counseling. The kids who had once been targets of Ray's operation now found themselves surrounded by people who genuinely cared about their future. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and lingering fears. But for the first time in a long time, there was also hope. As I watched Tanner leading a group of kids in a basketball game one evening, I felt a strange sense of peace. He had come a long way from the man who had stopped my ambulance that fateful day. Think he's finally forgiven himself? Sarah asked, appearing beside me. I think he's trying, I said. And maybe that's enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the court in a warm golden glow, I realized something. This wasn't just a story about redemption or forgiveness. It was about resilience, the kind that doesn't come easily, but is earned through struggle, sacrifice, and the courage to change. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to transform in ways I hadn't thought possible. The community center, once a haven for fear and desperation, had become a hub of empowerment. Walls once covered in graffiti were now adorned with murals, painted by the kids' vivid, hopeful depictions of their dreams and aspirations. Tanner's mentorship program flourished, growing into something far bigger than either of us had imagined. What had started as a small effort to guide a handful of kids had expanded into a full-scale movement, with volunteers pouring in from across the city. Teachers came to tutor, local businesses offered internships, and even the police department, with Brennan's influence, began holding workshops on safety and accountability. It wasn't perfect, healing rarely is, but it was progress. One evening, as the center was closing up, Tanner and I sat on the bleachers in the gym, watching a few kids play a pickup game. Jerome, now one of the program's leaders, called out plays with a confidence that made me smile. You ever think we'd get here? Tanner asked, breaking the comfortable silence. No, I admitted. Not like this. He nodded, a faint smile on his face. I used to think redemption was a finish line, like once you crossed it, you were done. But it's not. It's a process, a constant choice. You've made a lot of good choices lately, I said, giving him a sideways glance. He chuckled softly. Still plenty of bad ones I've got to make up for. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man transformed, not by perfection, but by effort. You're doing the work, Tanner. That's what matters. Later that night, I stopped by the hospital to check on Margaret, Tanner's mother. Her health had improved significantly since that first chaotic night, though she still had her battles. She greeted me with a warm smile as I walked into her room, setting down a bouquet of flowers on her bedside table. "Marcus," she said, her voice soft but steady, "you're always such a welcome sight." "Just doing my rounds," I said, taking a seat. She chuckled, shaking her head. "You've done more than that. For Tanner, for this community. For me, your son did most of the heavy lifting," I said. "He's the one who chose to change. And you gave him the chance to," she said, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "That's no small thing." Her words stayed with me as I left the hospital, walking through the quiet streets toward my apartment. The next morning, the community center held a celebration, a block party to honor the progress the neighborhood had made. Families filled the streets, sharing food and laughter. The kids put on performances, and Tanner stood at the center of it all, a reluctant but proud leader. Brennan even showed up, leaning against a parked car with a rare smile on his face. "Looks like you've got things under control here," he said when I approached him. "We're getting there," I replied. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It's good to see people coming together like this. Makes the job worth it. Thanks for backing us up," I said. "None of this would have happened without you." Brennan waved me off. "Don't sell yourself short. You and Tanner are the real heroes here." As the sun began to set, Tanner took the makeshift stage, holding up a microphone with an awkward smile. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. "But I just want to say thank you to everyone here who's believed in this program, who's supported these kids, and who's helped make this neighborhood what it is today. We've been through a lot, but this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. There's still work to do, and we can't do it alone. So let's keep showing up for each other. Let's keep building something better." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Tanner stepped down, I saw Jerome rush up to him, pulling him into a hug. Watching them, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just for Tanner, but for the community we'd fought so hard to protect. That night, as I sat on the steps outside the center, Tanner joined me, 2 cans of soda in hand. He handed me one, cracking his open and taking a sip. "You know," he said, staring at the horizon, "there were days I didn't think I could come back from who I was." "You did, though," I said, "and you brought a lot of people with you." He smiled, a quiet, reflective expression. "Thanks for not giving up on me, Marcus." I raised my soda can, clinking it against his. "Thanks for proving me right." As the stars came out, I realized that while the work would never truly be done, we'd accomplished something extraordinary. Together, we turned pain into progress, fear into hope, and division into unity. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.